the Toronto Star. I'm Sabah Itazaz, and this matters. Last Friday, Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced expanding police power and not paid sick leave to curb a pandemic. Much of the public expressed outrage that carding was back. Police services across Ontario stated they would not comply and conduct random checks. The province walked it back, but the damage was done. And the rules still allow police to stop anyone if they have a reason to suspect that someone is not following stay-at-home orders. The Ontario Human Rights Commission says it's worried that these discretionary police powers will put racialized and vulnerable people at risk. The data has already shown us the irony of inequality. Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people most disproportionately hit by COVID also bore the brunt of COVID rule enforcement.
We moved too quick with having people being pulled over per se. You call it carding.
On the weekend of the initial announcement, Ottawa-based criminal defense lawyer Natasha Calvinho offered legal help on Twitter to anyone being stopped and questioned. She tweeted that among her callers were a Black dad with a baby and a woman fleeing an abusive situation. She's here to talk about that and offer some legal advice on what you can do if you find yourself in a police interaction and you happen to be someone who looks like me. Later on, Star reporters Alyshah, Hasham, and Rankin will join me to talk about how COVID-related police powers affect already over-policed communities and why parallels are being drawn with the historically controversial practice of carding. Hi, Natasha. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Hi.
So, Natasha, tell me about what happened over the weekend after the initial provincial announcements around police powers. What made you issue that Twitter call out, and then what happened?
So I watched the press conference like most Canadians or most Ontarians did, and I was immediately gravely concerned by the language that our premier was using. He was basically giving the police and bylaw officers carte blanche to stop anybody that they saw fit for any reason or no reason whatsoever. It was a gross overreach of police and bylaw powers. I was concerned because I've already seen the impact of COVID-19 and the restrictive measures that, quite frankly, have been put on us with reason, but the drastic impact that it's already having on people in marginalized communities. So people of color, homeless individuals, people already marginalized, drug addicts, drug users. So I was concerned, rightfully so, that this was going to give the police just another way and an easier way to stop individuals. Because even if you're breaching before public health measures or you're committing a crime or suspected to have committed a crime, police have to have reasonable probable grounds to stop you, which means that they have to have a good faith basis for saying, hey, I want to talk to you, which is why we've seen issues with carding in the past, and there's been directives that they can't do that anymore. So my concern as a criminal defense lawyer is it was going to open that up again.
So you issued a Twitter call out offering help to anybody who was going through something of that nature. What happened? What kind of calls did you get?
Yep, I put out a Twitter call out as you framed it because I wanted people to know that they weren't alone in this. This is a scary time for all of us, and it's a scary time, particularly for marginalized communities. And I wanted people to know that they could contact me and that I would give them free legal advice and that would try to walk them through it. And mostly just people didn't really need legal advice. They just wanted somebody to talk to and to kind of alleviate their concerns. What happened over the weekend is not new. It is something that happens to marginalized individuals day in and day out. I see it in my practice. I see it every day. The only time it gets attention is when somebody's charged. And then there we have an avenue of a charter application to try to get evidence excluded. But I know in my work, and I know that other people who do similar work or social services, they see it happening. In this case, what was different is that because it doesn't affect most Canadians don't react to the day-to-day police stopping or the arbitrary detentions or the things of that nature. This time, and I think why it gained such traction and went so viral on Twitter, not just for myself, but from other people, is this affected all of us. So the white, middle-class, privileged groups that didn't really think about it before were now like, whoa, you mean the police can stop me outside of my house to see what I'm doing for no reason? And it was an opportunity for me to highlight or to flag that this happens every day.
Can you tell me a little bit about those calls without obviously compromising anybody's privacy? But you did mention on Twitter that you were being contacted by a lot of vulnerable people or people from marginalized or racialized communities.
I was. And I can say this is not an Ottawa problem. I received calls from across Ontario. And in fact, a couple of the calls were also from Quebec. So there were calls, there were emails, there were texts, there were WhatsApp messages. They took whatever avenue that they could to reach out to me. There's not a lot of recourse, right? Like, for example, the one gentleman that was stopped for and detained for an hour, what can he do? He left without charges, but he's scared. So a lot of people from across the province of Ontario who were getting these types of calls, my assessment of it without having met with him is that they were marginalized, whether it be a Black woman or a Black man or an Indigenous person who was homeless. They were typically marginalized. I suspected that the one woman I spoke to was white, but she's also leaving a domestic situation. So maybe marginalized in a different way, vulnerable in a different way, not something that thankfully I've ever had to experience or a lot of people have had to, but they were all marginalized. I'm getting calls now more. I'm not getting those I've been stopped calls. I'm still getting a lot of messages and a lot of requests for information on what do I do? Can I do this? Can I not do that? And I think that's important to keep that conversation going as well.
So people still have questions and concerns, even as the province has somewhat toned down the orders.
Right, because they did somewhat tone down the order. But when it was first released, is we can stop you for any reason, anywhere, and you got to give us our name. I'm still concerned about the new order because it clawed back, it stepped back a bit and said, look, we're not going to stop you for no reason, but we know that happens every single day across the province. We're not going to stop you. It's illegal for us to stop you for no reason. You now have to give more information, which causes me a bit of concern. So before it was just your name. Now it's name, address, and date of birth. So it's almost like a backdoor carding way, right? They're still collecting that information, but is that not still carding, but with a public health bent to it? So what's going to happen with that information? Why are they still able to do this? If I'm not doing anything other than walking in the park, why is it okay to ask that information?
Natasha, do you have any quick tips for someone who might be apprehensive of this, for what they should do if they get stopped by law enforcement or get into an interaction with them over COVID rules?
First and foremost, I do have some tips. You just need to be mindful of your surroundings and your situation. I hate to say this, but we're still going to see more marginalized people getting stopped. Homeless people outside of shelters, Black, brown, racialized minorities. It's going to happen. My first tip is, although you might not want to do this, be polite. You know, you're not the person in the position of power. You have no authority. You're being stopped by somebody who has or thinks that he or she has authority. Where things can get dangerous, where things can go off track, is when you're not polite. I tell this to my clients. I tell this to everybody. I've done it. Stop for a speeding ticket. Just be polite. Ask questions is the next tip. Why am I being stopped? Have I committed a crime? Do you think I've committed a crime? Is this a health measure issue? And then the third thing is, can I call my lawyer? Call a lawyer. I'm not just speaking about me. Call anybody. Can I call my lawyer? Can I call a family member? Again, be polite. Provide the information that they're asking. It's better. It's going to be a shorter exchange for right or for wrong. If you get in and get out, give your name, your address, and your date of birth. And then if they're still detaining you, repeat those questions. Why have you stopped me? Am I free to leave? Am I under arrest? I want to leave. I want to leave. And if you've got an opportunity to do it discreetly, hit record on your cell phone when you know that you're being approached by the police. Do a voice note, not necessarily a video recording, but have some sort of record of that transaction. If you're detained for a long period of time, you might want to also consider, after it is over, reaching out to a civil lawyer. There's nothing that we can do in a criminal context until and if you're charged with something, but reach out to a civil lawyer. They can always help you if your rights were infringed.
Natasha, thank you so much for your time and for your insight. That was really helpful.
Thank you very much.
That was Natasha Calvinho of Calvinho Criminal Defense. We'll be right back. Star reporters Alyshah, Hasham, and Jim Rankin join me now to talk police powers and this city's controversial history with carding. Alyshah and Jim, thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
I'm going to start with you, Alyshah. What went through your mind when you heard the initial announcement expanding police powers? Because I do remember spending the weekend obsessively checking my pockets for my ID every time I was outdoors.
Yeah, I think it's a really
one of maybe the darkest days I think we've had in the pandemic. And just to sort of set up what had happened right before the announcement, we'd seen this catastrophic modeling. We'd seen ICU doctors begging and pleading for sick days, talking about the racialized essential workers they had in their ICU, sort of parents of young children dying. We know the numbers, racialized people are 3 times more likely to be infected, 3 times more likely to end up in hospital in Toronto. We know that the 2 million or so essential workers who are going to work every day in the GTA are mostly racialized people, immigrants. Knowing all of that and waiting for the announcement for the government, people hoping for things like paid sick days and paid vaccination leave, to hear that what they were doing was allowing police to arbitrarily stop people and ask for identification and ask for the reason they were out, it just, I think, felt like this just incredible, I don't even know what the right word to describe it is, but just there was this really overwhelming sense of hopelessness that I think I saw permeate through people in their response to what had come out that day. Sort of instead of doing something to help people who are putting their lives at risk every day, instead they were doing something that would put fear into those very same people who are most at risk. And as you said, sort of people didn't know what that meant. Did you need to have a letter for your employer? It was Friday evening too. So like people might have done with work for the week, didn't know what it means to provide that information. What about language barriers? What about young people? There was very little clarity about how those rules would be applied. What about retention of that kind of information? There was so much we didn't know as well about how this might be applied.
And obviously the reactions were massive. A lot of people had very strong feelings about this. And then we saw the government sort of walk this back. Could you talk a little bit about that? How did they sort of tone it down? It's still the police or the law enforcement officer's prerogative to stop anyone based on their perception or assessment that someone is breaking COVID rules, right? So are there still concerns that this situation can still result in people's rights being violated, particularly BIPOC people or those living in over-policed communities?
Right. So within 24 hours, we saw that the government walked back the initial announcement that police could arbitrarily stop people, that they could arbitrarily pull over people and ask for address and reason for being out. And they changed that to say, look, the intent of this is to disrupt social gatherings or people who are sort of flouting the stay-at-home order. I think the exact phrasing is, if they have a reason to suspect you're participating in an organized public event or social gathering, they may require you to provide information to ensure that you're complying with the restrictions. But as you say, that's sort of a really discretionary thing. And all of the legal experts you will speak to will say anytime you have that kind of discretionary power, that's where we see things like the kind of discrimination and racial profiling that I think Jim will talk about a little bit later. And all of the same concerns still apply because, there's lots of decisions that go into that. Where are police going to be patrolling? Who are police going to be approaching? Who gets the benefit of the doubt? Who gets sort of a warning or a question? Who gets, the way that people are approached is different. There's a lot of different elements that come into play. And just the last thing I'll add about this is sort of police forces sort of saying that they're going to take one approach, like an approach maybe grounded in education, before enforcement or in that order. We also see individual police officers on the ground maybe not sort of following the sort of rhetoric we hear from the top level.
And also it's just about what's being said, right? Many are saying that they might have walked it back, but the damage has already been done. I mean, what kind of signaling or messaging are racialized people getting from all of this, particularly those who've had experiences of over-policing and racial profiling in the past?
Right. My colleague, Wendy Gillis, talked to a mental health professional on Monday, and she said that her clients had been coming to her with lots of fear and concern over the weekend. And you got to remember as well, journalists might be very on top of the sort of regular, sort of rapid changing rules and regulations that are coming in all the time, but regular people may not be on top of those things. And so it's hard to keep on track of what are the rules. Are playgrounds open? Are playgrounds closed? Are skate parks open? Are they closed? Where do you have to wear a mask? Under what conditions is a social gathering considered a social gathering? There's concern about if you're with your roommates who are part of your household, will you be asked questions? How do you prove that you're a part of a household? There's just a lot of questions that creates fear. And then we also know just like the impact, particularly on young people, of feeling like you're being racially profiled, that you're being targeted, that you're being over policed. Those are long lasting effects. It undermines trust in authority, it undermines trust in government, and policies like this undermine trust in our public health officials and the people who are making these rules. It makes people maybe feel like they're less likely to follow the rules. So there's a lot of implications for this kind of hasty and potentially really damaging things that can come of it.
Jim, I'm going to ask you to weigh in. With the COVID-related enhanced police powers announced last Friday, we saw parallels being drawn to carding and how this is basically a continuation. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, I think that's absolutely fair. When they announced what they were going to do with the policing powers, I just said to myself, they just perfectly defined in words what no one ever did around carding, which is that you can arbitrarily stop people and with no good reason, which is, I got to say, it flies in the face of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, which should supersede everything. You have the right not to be arbitrarily stopped. So when they said it just plainly like that, I thought, well, there it is. There's the description of carding that maybe for decades and decades had been elusive, but they just said it and they're going to do it. And yeah, no, it's absolutely fair. That is the very essence of carding.
And I'm still fairly new here. I'm still coming to terms with some of these disturbing things and developments that I've been seeing here. Can you shed some light on what carding actually was and what it entails for someone who's been a victim?
I should add, too, that even the modified version, as Alyshah was talking about, that they came back with on Saturday, there's a tremendous amount of discretion still there. So a police officer just has to have the belief that you're heading towards a gathering of some sort. That's pretty vague. And so if you're a young Black kid wearing a backpack, is that enough to say, oh, that backpack, I think he's headed to a gym or something. I'm gonna stop him and detain him. But carding, it goes back decades and decades in policing, not just in Toronto or Ontario or Canada. It was a way of police getting to, quote unquote, know the community that they policed, and they did it by various means. And the most aggressive way was to stop and question and document people while they're, going about their business. So in public spaces, while you're on foot, on bicycle, they pull your car over, they'll get the information about everybody who's in the car with you. And this data would end up in a massive police database in Toronto. It was huge, with no purging requirements. So it had all your personal details there, including your skin color and the people that you were stopped with. And then, the police justified the practice as a way of having an investigative tool that they could, say a crime happened and Jim gets shot and killed, and they search my name and they find out that I'm associated with Alyshah, that we were stopped together in this area back, 4 years ago. That was the value the police saw in the practice of doing this, but it was arbitrary. And then it caused, tremendous collateral damage. It's being done all across the city of Toronto, but even more so in areas where there was more poverty, where violent crime was happening, and where more racialized people were living. So that is the old carding. And we know, based on more recent surveys, because the data, it's not there anymore, they stopped doing it, the collecting of the data is still happening. There's still a lot of stopping and questioning and sometimes searching going on, but it's not being recorded anymore.
And Jim, I know you've done such extensive reporting on this. I think it was 7 years of Freedom of Information requests, I believe, to kind of delve into the problematic history of carding in Toronto and how it has worked disproportionately to target Black and brown people to some extent. Can you take me through that a little bit?
We knew that police have been doing this for decades. We didn't really have a name for it. And in 2003, the Star, several colleagues of mine have been working on race-based data for a while by then, by about 4 or 5 years. And we knew that the Toronto police had data around these stops where they just documented you and there was no criminality and you ended up in the database. So we did some research and figured out what that database was. And then we asked for it in a Freedom of Information request. Again, that was 2003. And as you noted, it took us 7 years to get the data. And we had to go to 2 levels of court. It cost the Star a lot of money to get that data. And a long, long time, obviously. And then when we got it, it just took a few simple keystrokes, the running of an algorithm, and you could see plain as day what was no surprise to people in Toronto's Black communities and brown communities. Brown was one of the skin colors in the database, that police were disproportionately stopping and questioning people of color in the city. And so the data just served as a foundation for all the anecdotal stories that we've been hearing, particularly at the Toronto Star, where I always like to call the Star the unofficial police complaints bureau, because ever since I started at the Star, that's sort of what happened. Something happened with policing, and inevitably the Toronto Star was the sounding board for it. So it goes back a long, long way, and it's still happening. And the collateral damage that is caused by it has been recognized now by police. Although the practice is still happening, I don't think it's happening as often. What happens is if you get continually stopped, you start to feel like there is something criminal about you. Like, why are they constantly stopping me? And you don't feel free. And so you're growing up with that. You know, you're a perfectly fine, law-abiding citizen, but you see it all around you. And so it does damage. And what happens is people stop trusting the police. And when that happens, it makes communities less safe because they're not going to trust the police to properly investigate when they dial 911. It was an incredibly damaging police practice that, you know, now we have regulations in Ontario around it that better define when police can stop you. But these pandemic measures, they are confusing. And it's no wonder that people are fearful of leaving their houses and wondering, you know, what do I have to carry with me? And I think the damage has been done with certain communities for sure. And walking it back, it's equally confusing for people.
And there's been several reported incidents of unpleasant interactions of people with law enforcement officers, especially since the Ford announcement of people being randomly stopped and checked. I believe there's been a recent video of a 12-year-old kid being pushed down by an OPP officer. At the same time, we saw more than 30 police services saying publicly that they refuse to comply with the provincial orders. So what was that exercise for? Is that an effort to build public trust, or is this a sort of disparity between the PR and policy comms and what's actually happening on ground that we're seeing?
Most police chiefs would have heard that news and thought, oh no, I don't want my officers out there having to do this, number one. And number two, if they're doing it, how many lawsuits are we going to face as a result? Because the initial plan was not going to hold up in court, as was pointed out by many different groups. And I think police chiefs and police boards, that they saw a giant headache coming. And they know the perceptions that are out there of random police checks. And everyone did leap to that comparison to carding. You know, the two of them together, it is a PR disaster if you started to go out there and do that. And I think when you saw so many police services say we're not doing it, it was clearly pointing out the flaws in that plan. And, you know, those that are enforcing it are not enlightened whatsoever. And the ones that said no to the government, they had already done their homework because they've been through the controversies already. And why invite another one?
Alyshah, I want your views on this as well, especially in light of these recent incidents that we are hearing about. The anxiety and just the constant expectation of having a negative interaction with the police. What impact could that have on the psyche of individuals and communities? And what kind of damage does racial profiling essentially do for people who are victims of it?
I just think we're all under incredible stress right now. And no more so than people who are having to go to work every day, who aren't getting paid sick days, who are putting themselves and their families at risk to work at factories and warehouses and at Tim Hortons and wherever else. And so then to have this extra fear, and we also know the areas that are hardest hit by COVID, and there's an overlap between those areas and areas that are subject to over-policing. People who are subject to over-policing are taking something that a community is already dealing with. We had the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. You know, we've had a year as well of protests about racial injustice and policing. And so if you just take all of that and say we're going to create this additional level of fear and stress about potential police harassment or having to answer questions and not knowing what the consequences would be. And these aren't people, community legal groups immediately put out phone numbers that you could call, but these aren't people with access to legal resources. These are people who it's just adding a whole other level of stress to people who are already under the most amount of stress that you could imagine. And I would also just add that, people who've studied how this has worked so far in the pandemic say that this doesn't actually work as a deterrence measure, particularly, handing out fines to people. A lot of those fines will be ultimately contested in court. And then the courts are, I can tell you, already extremely backlogged. But also, you're going to find people who already can't afford to miss a day of work. Is that a truly effective measure? And we don't know that, are we scaring people into staying home who might have otherwise gone out? The people who've looked into this say we don't really know that's the case. And in fact, what we are seeing is actual harm being visited upon marginalized groups. And, my colleague Victoria Gibson immediately thought to ask, well, what's going to happen with the homeless population? And, the government has said the homeless population is not subject to the stay-at-home order. But, again, in practice, how are you going to determine that? It creates all of these potential avenues for harm that I'm not sure that it's outweighed by any benefit or any clear benefit in any meaningful way.
And there's research to support that, even from back in the first wave. Alyshah, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association did a report that found that BIPOC groups were actually facing the brunt of COVID-related enforcement. And Jim, I'm going to ask you the same question. As Alyshah said, when we talk about who is affected by these new orders, we're basically talking about the same people who form a big part of the essential workforce and those who have already been disproportionately impacted by COVID. So does harsh COVID-related law enforcement really help keep Canadians safe, or we're just risking pushing already marginalized people further away from the support that they need?
This is not a policing issue. It's not an enforcement issue. It's a public health concern. And the voices that came out, the ones that were calling for throwing the vaccine into areas where it needs to be, maybe diverting some, all those smart things, those are the measures that need to be taken. Enforcement, it's not even fair to the police to say, go out there and do that. I mean, people keep turning to them to do more and more, and that's not their job, and they shouldn't be out there doing that kind of thing. And what's interesting about carding compared to the COVID crisis is that the disproportionality, when you look at who's coming down with COVID and who got carded, it's the same proportions. You see them, it's the same. 3 times more likely if you're Black to be carded. A little bit more than 2 if you have brown skin. And so it's kind of ironic that they're now, wanting to use policing measures to go after the very people who are keeping us going and out there working and having to be out there in a public space. Whereas, a lot of the wealthier people like ourselves who can work from home, we're not going to be subject to that kind of attention. So it's absolutely not the right approach to turn to law enforcement to, enforce these things. What they can do is look for the yahoos, the COVIDiots that are having parties, and focus on that. And I think that's what police services across the country, that's what their focus is on. And that when they're told to do this other measure, it really, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like there's no common sense there.
Alyshah, Jim, thank you so much for an incredibly thought-provoking and a really important conversation. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
I was speaking to Toronto Star reporters Alyshah Hasham and Jim Rankin. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by SoCalled, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.